Okay, so now we want to look a bit into customizing the authoring experience for users. So if you want to have users create XML first content, for instance, maybe users that are not very familiar with XML, then you may want to provide them an easier interface. And we developed for Lightweight DITA, which is all markup flavors. We introduced at some point a lightweight version, simplified book, TI, simple, Lightweight DITA. So everyone starts with the standard, make it more complex after a few versions. Then it's too big, too complex. Let's see how we can get people to start with our XML language, right? So there are these kind of lightweight flavors, and for Lightweight DITA we developed a customization of Oxygen to support that. That features placeholder, inline hints, inline actions, inline editors to interact with the attribute information, so you can edit attributes. We rename the elements from short desk, for instance, to short description, and so on. So users don't necessarily need to know the exact way that information is encoded in the XML structure. Then it's always when you enter a section, you don't get anything because there's no required content. It can be anything in a section, but users usually want a title and a paragraph to start with, right? So this kind of being able to specify, well, when we insert a section, the usual elements are these. Add them, automatically. These are the elements that should be added in a content. So let me start with an example. So when you start a Lightweight DITA document, you can see, you have these inline actions to enter a short description, or after you insert something, you can click on this plus, which then turns into a close, and then you can choose from different proposals with a common element. And let's say you inserted this definition list, and you have this term and description that then you don't know exactly what you should do. You can press on this information icon, and you get this hint information that tells you, how this should be used for, and so on, right? As I said, here it says short description, also the placeholder and the element name. As you can see here, it says short description. If we insert a list, then we can easily insert a new item just pressing this plus here. Let's say we insert a web link. And then if I want to edit the target for this link or some other information, I have this edit button next to the link, and if I hit this, then I have access to different attributes for this element, and when I'm done, I can say OK, and this closes, right? So this kind of user interface can be developed rather easily with Oxygen. So Lightweight DITA is implemented as an extension of the DITA framework. So when we support a specific XML language, we group different configuration information and resources in what we call an Oxygen framework. So we have such frameworks for DITA, DOBOOK, TI, and I don't know, tens of different languages. And you can extend such a framework and then just make some changes to that. So the Lightweight DITA framework extends the DITA, inherits basically all the DITA support, but then it provides specific CSS files for Lightweight DITA, and we use less. Oxygen supports also less. Less compiles to CSS, generates CSS, but introduces variables, kind of functions that expand to different CSS constructions. And then we have also a content completion configuration file. So we have a configuration file that allows you to, I mentioned earlier, so even if we insert a section with the content completion, you see that you have a title and a paragraph added automatically to the document, right? So even whenever you insert a section, you want to have a title and a paragraph inserted. That can be done this level of configuration file. So I mentioned less versus CSS. Oxygen supports less directly, but we have also an option that allows you, whenever you save a less file, the CSS file is generated. The corresponding CSS file is generated. So basically you can use the generated CSS file if you want to not pay the conversion process all the time that less file is used, let's say. So the main idea with using less is that you can define using, they call these mix-ins, and these are like functions. So then you can define something, a library. Imagine that also in Word you have a styles library. With less you can also define a styles library, and then you can just use those in a declarative way from the main less file. So you can, I define for Lightweight DITA a less library file that has these functions, let's say, placeholder, and then you specify a content. So you match on short desk, for instance, and you say placeholder is short description. So whenever that is empty, that gray text will be whatever you put in that placeholder for short desk. .hint, which basically generates that icon, and when you press on that, it hides or shows. So this information, right? So the entire process of putting the button there, when you click on that, showing the content, when you click again, it hides the content. Everything is hidden in the library under .hint. So just say .hint on section, and you have the hints for section. Marking a section with a specific name, like in this case, you see it's marked short description, while here, here is marked section, but sometimes, say if I insert a table here, this does not mark this as a table, right? It's not marked. And so on. Delete action, those actions that you see here, these actions that you see here are, you just say add action and then say action 1, action ID, and specify the IDs of the actions that you want to add. The editable part, when you edit something, it's this editable, and then you can use a text field URL chooser, for instance, to edit different attributes. So just specify the name of the attribute and the label. So all this basically is hidden in this library. As a user, you can just point to the library and use these functions. So the less file basically for Lightweight DITA will import the library. And whenever you save the file, we compile the CSS file, which is used by the Oxygen framework, the Lightweight DITA framework. And the framework can use the less file directly if you want to. But usually, you know, you can just point to the generated CSS file. So Another approach here, and I see I didn't update the PDF slides, is that we can use also, so an alternative to less is to, you can use XSLT, for instance, to generate the CSS file. So you can have an XML file that just declares something, or you decide what you put in that XML file, and then you can generate the CSS file. We use this technique for generating inline actions for DITA, like this kind of actions. Well, you can just describe the content model in an XML file for an element, and then we have an XSLT script that generates all the CSS to implement this kind of dynamic actions in the document. So the less file basically provides placeholder hints, inline actions, and editors. So here is an example. In the CSS file, we can have section title, and then placeholder that says section title or whatever. And this is how it will be rendered in the editor. So in the less file, basically, for Lightweight DITA, whenever you want to control the placeholder is what you have when an element is empty, right? So here, if I start typing, that gray text disappears, right? So the placeholder text is what you see when the element does not have content. In order to have a hint, you just match on the element in CSS and say hint. And then we have an HTML file where this has hints minus, and this is the element name. So this .hint function in the library will look into the HTML file for an element with the ID hints minus the element name, and we'll take that content and we'll present that in this bubble controlled by this I button. A very interesting thing is that if you change the library to implement hints differently, you don't need to change the less file, because the less file it just expresses an intention, basically, that I want a hint for this element, but I don't care how that hint will be actually delivered to the user, right? So in a way, this is it's an advantage, because separates concerns, basically, the implementation of what a hint actually means, and how that and where you want those hints to be. Inline actions, so those actions that you see, here, like a paragraph, list, tables, and then a separator section, and an action group with inserting DL, figure, object, definition list that I used earlier, and so on, is controlled with something like this. So on a section, we can say just actions after, which is a function in the library, and then we say action paragraph, action unordered list, action order list, and so on, and that generates this behavior with the plus sign and close sign, and places the actions there, and all that. And you can reuse this library also for your own languages. So you can take it from Lightweight DITA, use it for your own needs, and then maybe you can change the library, add more to that, whatever. And to edit a cross-reference, so we just say editable inline, and then with this text field combo box and so on, we define what attributes are made editable. So this editable inline controls the edit and done button, and shows the triggers the oxyedit pseudo class, like hover or something like that, right? So it's a custom pseudo class that you can trigger from an action, and then on xref, when the element has this pseudo class, then you can add different content, right? So, and then you can use this functions again from the library to say, I want a text field for this attribute with this label, I want a combo box for this attribute with this label, and so on. And that's the result. So from a customization point of view, once you define the library, it's quite easy for someone, even without skills, to customize how that will work. The configuration file remaps the element names and adds that usual content, attribute values, and you can also exclude or remove completely some elements to be presented. So basically in the configuration file you have render element short desc as short description, and then in the content completion, in the breadcrumb, everywhere you will have this propagated. For instance, for element proposals, you can match on a section, and then you say insert elements title and paragraph, title and P, and then whenever you insert a section, these will be the elements that will be added automatically. You can match also on different attributes and add new values or define the values for those attributes. You can also use an XSLT script that maybe uses the document function to call a web service and bring in those values so they don't have to be hard-coded in the document. Let me just quickly show you the content configuration file. So this ccconfig file that is used for Lightweight DITA, it has a predefined name and it has to be in the class path in the framework. And here you can see different attribute values. Then we have the render topic, render title as, render prologue as, prologue information, and so on. So the remapping. And here we have the common content that's added automatically to specific elements, right? So as takeaways, I would like to encourage you to explore this content completion configuration file that is intended to solve many of the common customization issues very easily. And take into account this idea of separating styles into a library and then using that library, because it simplifies a lot of this customization part. So I hope I'm just in time to allow some time to Alex, for Alex. So thank you, and if you have a few questions. Yes? Oh, sorry. Yes?
Well, it makes me sad because I have made something not very nice but similar in function like this, and you did a better job. One of the things that I was working with and I didn't solve it was that to make things schema aware. For instance, you have a section and you want to delete it, but you can't delete it if there is just one section. Is it possible to do that? To remove the delete button if you can't delete?
Not yet. Sort of like maybe we could add some pseudo classes required.
Yeah.
So
that would be nice, because now you have to tell the user you can't delete it.
Right. So if an element is required, then don't present this section.
Maybe that is connected with the question I had. In those selectors of elements, can you also use multiple selectors like section and then between brackets the first? So
Oh yes,
a
yeah.
different thing on the first section.
Yeah, sure. You support.
Case, if you have a rule for the first section and you leave out the delete, then you already have what you're looking for, because the second section.
Yeah, but you need to implement that logic also in the CSS, where Peter wanted to have that automatically from the schema.
Yes.
You need to duplicate that logic also in the CSS file to know the CSS level that the first section is required. Or
So the CSS is
he wanted to have that automatically from the schema. to take that information automatically from the schema rather than putting the same logic in the CSS. That's how I understood the question. Because you have, your schema can say, I have one or more sections. So the first section, if you have just one section, you may not want to present a delete action. And to be able to take that information automatically from the schema rather than from a CSS. But Oxygen supports, like first column first or last or first of type, I think. A lot of additional selectors.
Can this element be added? But there was no function. Can it be deleted?
So I guess what I'm looking for is more generic, like if you, in this less file, you say, well, section, and then you have all these different kinds of like hint and all that. Could I use section / title and then topic / title and have different things?
Yeah, even... so here's the list file for Lightweight DITA. So for the placeholders, for instance, you can see section title has a different placeholder from the title.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So of course you can use whatever. So here is we support also note, for instance, an xref which does not have an href and does not have a keyref. Then I put this placeholder warning, which adds a placeholder but with red, so you can have like a kind of validation done the level of CSS if you want, with injecting static content with different errors in some situations. So kind of overlapping with schematron if you want, but using CSS selectors. And then Oxygen also supports column has, which basically allows you to look inside of an element. So you can do something for a section which has a title, for instance. This framework for Lightweight DITA that you've seen works also in the web author. So the same editing experience works in the web author as well. So once I developed this customization with less for the desktop version and with the configuration file, the same automatically works in the web author.